This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include former state senator Howard Lee, former mayor of Chapel Hill, former cabinet secretary, we just could go on and on and on. Welcome, Howard. Syndicated columnist John Hood. We welcome back Chris Fitzsimon from NC Policy Watch and political consultant Doug Raymond. We got a good show for you this week, and we want to focus on the differences between the House and Senate budgets and talk about when we might see a new state budget. But first, we've got to talk about the legislature's about-face on voter identification. The lawsuit about requiring identification before voting had not even gone to court and been settled, but a quick and decisive action by both houses of the legislature voted to soften the voter ID requirement and sent the bill to the governor, who signed it. HB 836 amended the voter ID bill to say that during the early voting period, election officials will help people without an ID to use a mail-in ballot, which doesn't require an identification. And on Election Day, voters without an ID can sign an affidavit saying they had a reasonable impediment, like conflicting work schedules, an illness, or a stolen ID, to qualify and receive a provisional ballot. Doug, the question everybody wants answered is why? Why did the legislature feel it important to pass this bill? Why now? Why not wait for the court case? What do you think?
Well, the legislative leadership have said for a long time that they were getting input and they were trying to that they were open to possibly massaging the bill, but I think in all truthfulness, a funny thing happened on the way to the courthouse, and that was they found out that there were some problems at the DMV, at the driver's license office. If you remember the initial law, you were supposed to be able to get a photo ID free of charge going, and they found out that people were being charged, and some people who didn't have the money were being turned away. And I think they knew that they had a problem when they got to court because of that, so that's why they made the adjustments.
But the DMV commissioner, John, said that the people that had been charged had been refunded their money and that these problems had been corrected. Is this all there is to this story?
Well, I think there is another angle. It's related, which is South Carolina has a photo ID requirement, but South Carolina also has a comparable provision to allow people in hardship cases to do other kinds of things to identify their identity at the polls and cast provisional ballots and so forth. The South Carolina law has been upheld. So I think if you're in North Carolina and you're looking at a court case, and you might still think you're going to win, but just in case you're looking at a safe harbor, you look at South Carolina, and as I understand it, I haven't gone and independently verified all the data, but when they ran an election under this system in South Carolina, a trivial number of people used the exemption. So basically, I think the entire issue is much ado about not very much. If very few people use these hardship exemptions, then so what? If lots of people use them, along the lines of suggesting the photo ID requirement doesn't really mean anything, then you can look at that and
Howard,
you can
this is much
revisit
ado about nothing. Why didn't they pass this in 2013 when they passed this voter ID bill to start off with? I mean, this is just, it seems like that they're caving in before the court case even comes.
Well, I've always thought this voter ID bill was a solution looking for a problem. And I think John makes an excellent point in that the numbers we're talking about when it gets to the exemption is going to be so small. I do respect them for recognizing they've created some roadblocks that need to be dealt with. They've moved to deal with those roadblocks, and I think hopefully it will encourage more people.
But Chris, the whole thing here was we passed this so that we could eliminate voter fraud.
Right.
Now we're putting a provision in here that says that if you have a reasonable impediment, and we're going to leave it up to the registrars at the various election places to decide what a reasonable impediment is?
You have to remember, you have to sign an affidavit and you have to have some form of information. Look, a couple things happened here. First of all, the lawyers told them we have depositions now that have been filed in this case that show people were charged for their photo IDs, people were turned away by DMV for their photo IDs. South Carolina has a law that has this in it. That's been held up. It's very similar, as John mentioned. So this was the lawyers telling them, you got to do this, and it was almost unanimous. Almost all the Republicans and Democrats voted for it, even the ones who claimed they wanted the strictest ID in the country. But there's another part of this that nobody's talking about. The McCrory administration and the General Assembly passed this law and promised that they would fully inform DMV, they would have everybody notified, they would take care of this. They didn't do it. Now the big worry is, do all the people who work in the polls know? One of the reasons that some of these people might not use this affidavit is all the poll workers might not tell them about it. So this is still a huge story going forward.
So now we go to the court this past week, and the judge is saying, whoa, time out here. I got to look at this new law, and the lawyers for both the plaintiffs and the state saying, we got to look at this and figure this out. What's going to happen with the lawsuit?
Well, I think, as John said, they have patterned it against South Carolina. He's exactly right. The number that I've heard from a couple of legislators, that there was 111, I believe, challenges in South Carolina. So that's not a great number in a big election. The problem, as I see it, is this. It's not that this is a bad law, but the problem is especially conservatives, it's not what they were promised. They were promised voter ID. That's the confidence. They're very, very mad. So I do think the conservative base feels like they've lost the lawsuit before it went to court.
They've got an image problem over there in the legislature right now, don't they? After all the touting that they've done about having to have a voter identification in order to ensure that we don't have fraud.
You know, I understand what you're saying, but in my opinion, the actions that they took, they did anger some conservative activists, but the actions they took to amend the voter ID process will not make the public dislike the legislature. I don't understand why this will be considered a problem for them. It makes them look reasonable.
It just looks like they did an about-face.
It makes them look like they adjusted the law to experience and as they studied it, and it's not that big a deal.
I'll reiterate it. I think it's a good law, but it's not the law that conservatives were calling for.
And it's certainly not the rhetoric they used in 2013 when they were selling the law. I think that's a fair statement.
All right. If you like NC Spin and you want more, be sure to visit our website, ncspin.com, or NC Spin on Facebook. We've got exclusive video footage you can't get anywhere else. Plus, you can read perspectives from opinion leaders across our state. Get more balanced debate from the Old North State on ncspin.com, NC Spin on Facebook, or at NC Spin Tweets. Well, after these messages, we're going to get into the conferring and compromising on the state budget.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
98% of farms are family farms. Families that believe in values like hard work, faith, and integrity. Farmers care for their crops, land, and animals because it's their passion and it's the right thing to do. They take pride in raising healthy, affordable food for your family and their own. Their livelihood depends on it. At Farm Bureau, we believe in farmers, their values, and their way of life.
What's one simple way to make life even better in North Carolina? Cut taxes. Everyone wants to keep more of their hard-earned money. And tax cuts means more money in your pocket. Money for what your family really needs. Tax cuts mean more companies and more jobs. It's simple. A $2 billion tax cut will help North Carolina. Tell your legislator to keep their promise and support the Senate plan for North Carolina tax cuts.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
1 in 5 North Carolinians can't buy healthy foods in their communities, increasing their risk of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and some forms of cancer. It's time to invest in the Healthy Corner Store initiative. Visit ncallianceforhealth.org to learn more.
We now return to NC Spin.
There are few certainties when it comes to the General Assembly, but one you can count on this year is there won't be a new budget passed in time for the fiscal year starting July 1st. The differences between the budget passed by the House and the one passed by the Senate are so large that summer vacations are basically going to be a fleeting fancy. We want to spend the rest of the show talking about these differences and get our panelists' view as to what might happen. I want to ask each of you, what do you see as the biggest impediment reaching a budget decision right now? Chris, I'll start with you.
Well, I think there's no question about it. It's the fact that the Senate put literally a few hundred pages of policy decisions, big, small, and in between, and things that people are still discovering in the budget. Both Governor McCrory and House leaders are saying the first thing they want to do is debate the budget and get as much of the policy as they can out of the budget. Otherwise, we literally will be here until the fall. So I think there's going to have to be some agreement to let's settle how we spend this taxpayer money, and let's figure out then how to debate these policies. And that's going to be the biggest hurdle to begin it.
What do you think, Doug?
My memory is in January we did a show previewing the legislature, and I think several of us said that the length of the legislature is going to be decided by Medicaid, and I think that's still the case. I think that there's just a long way to go. It's a very complex thing, and there's no simple solutions, and they're not any closer right now than they were in January, so I think Medicaid's going to be...
I want to get into that in a few minutes. Howard, what do you think is going to be the biggest impediment?
Well, I certainly think Medicaid ranks right up there at the top, but I also see the education budget being somewhat of a problem as well. There are some major differences there, and of course the debate between whether to fund on a per pupil basis or whether to do the ADM funding, I think is going to cause some real angst.
John?
Well, I agree with these points that there'll be impediments. I think another one is simply the sheer difference in size. When you correctly account for it, the House budget increase was 6.2%. The Senate budget increase is 2.6%. These are some pretty big differences between the two, and they have other implications for savings and tax cuts and so forth. So I think the actual amount of spending is also going to be something we'll have to work out. It's going to take a while.
Howard, the House quickly rejected the Senate budget this past week, but also complained, as Chris said, about the number of tax and policy changes like Medicaid and sales tax provisions, economic development issues that should have been passed in non-budget bills, and according to one House leader, fundamentally transform the economy of our state. You've been in these conference committees before. What do they do about situations with policies? Can they just kick those to the side and just say we're not going to include them in a conference report, or do they have to deal with them?
No, they're going to have to deal with many of them, but they can also negotiate. In the past, and this is not a new movie that we're watching, it occurred when Democrats were in charge as well. There needs to be some sit-down discussion between the leadership, the governor and the two leaders of the houses, and then they can decide which ones they can let go and which ones they are going to dig in and keep in the budget regardless.
All right, so let's look at these budgets. As John mentioned, the House budget is $22.1 billion, which is a little over a 5% increase. The Senate is $21.4 billion. There's $700 million less spending in the Senate. And it's a 2% increase in the budget. The Senate cuts taxes to individuals and corporations, increases exemptions to individuals, increases sales taxes, and this is a big difference that seems to be causing a lot of people some heartburn, John.
It is. I mean, when I was talking about those previous numbers, what I'm saying is there's some off-budget items that are not being counted, and there's no good reason why they're not being counted. For example, the House budget had some money for film grants that was not considered a spending because it was taken off the top before they appropriated money. Gimmicks that nobody should be playing along with. So the real number is $22.4 billion in the House and 21.6, I think, or so in the Senate. Anyway, the tax differences are quite stark. Both of them have tax cuts. Both budgets have tax cuts in it. But the House primarily looks at fixing the medical expense deduction and doing a bunch of targeted credits. The Senate does have much broader tax relief.
But Chris, this sales tax increases. Now, this is causing an awful lot of conversations, particularly the increase on services, taxes on services like veterinarians, automobile mechanics, and advertising and so forth like that. And a lot of people are asking, how come you're taxing a few services like that, but you're not taxing lawyers and doctors?
Well, and it's a good question, and the lawyers and doctors have lobbyists, and you know, the Senate's goal has always been to do all this. We've talked many times on this show about if you just do a few, the people who you were doing it are complaining, and the folks who aren't being taxed aren't saying much, and they're keeping those taxes out of there. I think that's the second most controversial tax provision. The first one is all we've also talked about is a redistribution of local sales tax revenue, which is a huge controversy that crosses party lines. It's rural and urban. That's another one that I think is ridiculous to have in a budget.
Harry Brown comes from your section of the woods down there, and there's an awful lot of pushback on this redistribution on sales taxes, going from 75% at the point of sale to the local county versus now 20%, and the other 80% is distributed according to population. Can they get this thing through, Doug?
Well, that was number 2 on my list of things that might hold this up. And I do think that there's a lot more room for negotiation in this, But once again, this is a classic example of not a backdown. Now, Harry Brown's in the county adjacent to me, but me being in Carteret with our tourism economy, that would be a huge blow to our county as opposed to what it is in Onslow. So it's kind of depends on your perspective, and like a lot of things, it's going to be who makes the most noise as to where the balance comes out. But I think it's going to be a long and drawn-out debate.
Transportation, Medicaid, education. We care for those subjects after these messages.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
It's a fact. Patients who receive care in the medical home from a trusted family physician reduce healthcare costs through prevention, early detection, and affordable management of high-cost chronic diseases.
Every dollar invested in healthcare matters. Let's invest them wisely. Building on North Carolina's medical home model, better health begins with a medical home, a trusted family physician, the best return on our healthcare investment. Learn about the importance of medical homes at OurNCHealthcare.com.
1 in 5 North Carolinians can't buy healthy foods in their communities, increasing their risk of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and some forms of cancer. It's time to invest in the Healthy Corner Store initiative. Visit ncallianceforhealth.org to learn more.
Does your North Carolina business or organization have a story to tell? I'm Richard Campbell, and at Carolina Broadcasting and Publishing, we help tell stories that connect you to the people who will respond. We take the time to understand our clients' needs and what makes them unique. We craft their stories through the efficient use of words, images, and videos that resonate with their desired audience. We also know that a good story is incomplete without a call to action. On video, on air, online, and in print, from concept to final production, no one can help tell your story more effectively or affordably than we can. For special introductory offers, visit carolinabroadcasting.com or call 919-832-1416. Again, that's carolinabroadcasting.com. Let us help tell your story today.
We now return to NC Spin.
I want to continue our discussion on the differences between the House and Senate budgets. Let's talk about the transportation issue. The House is going to raise a lot of DMV fees. The Senate raises fewer fees, only $100 million, but the Senate estimates that they're going to do away with the annual distribution of the highway tax funds to the general fund, some $215 million, and say that they're going to end up with $300 million more per year so far as being able to build new road projects. In fact, they're estimating 70 projects can be added to this. So therefore, they don't need to put the North Carolina Connect, the governor's bond package on the table. The House, not so sure about this. They set aside $260 million for two-thirds bond money, which they can borrow without a vote of the people. What's going to happen as far as this transportation business
Well, I think this is another issue that would be interesting to see how the governor does. I mean, he was on NC Spin last week. He's been on a lot of shows around the state, and he continues to make the case that the best way to do this is to borrow money at a low interest rate. The Senate thinks they have enough funding to get things going with their transfer. But remember, that just means a general fund. That's money that comes out of the general fund that can't pay for schools and health care and a lot of other things, which is a point the governor actually made on UNC TV. This will be fascinating because I don't think the House is wild about the transportation bond either, and they don't have the Senate transportation provision in it. So this will be one of those tests of Governor McCrory's leadership.
Doug, one of the things that it does is it takes away some of the gas tax monies from the municipalities to be able to maintain streets within their local communities, and instead sets up an annual appropriation. Well, too many cities and counties now are waking up to the reality that what the legislature giveth, the legislature can take it away. This ain't going over real well with them, is it?
No, absolutely not. And I think, many people on both sides of the political aisle believe that the best decisions are made closer, farther down in government. And when you take money from the municipalities and move it up to the state, there's going to get a lot lost in the bureaucracy. So I think it's a very unpopular
Howard,
decision.
I got to talk about education. And the Senate budget is going to do away with some 13,000 teachers' assistants, adding 2,000 more teachers to the payroll. reducing class sizes. How is this playing out? How are people taking this? The education community is not real happy about it.
Well, there's real concern, and I have concerns too about reducing class size and not being able to find the teachers to fill the classrooms, having to come up with local governments, having to come up with additional resources to provide the space for these kids, having reduced the support within the schools, and then having not provided any money for materials that support the instructional process. I think that this is a disaster that is going to probably come home with the chickens coming home to roost.
Well, how about the one with driver's education, John, where they're talking about either eliminating driver's education, moving it to the community colleges, or just putting an exemption to kids that don't have to take driver's education?
There's a lot of discussion about driver's ed and how it affects the driving process and who should pay for it. And this is not a new issue. This was debated 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And the argument was, well, if families are going to have kids taking driver's ed and then have cars for them to drive, surely they can afford $200 or $300 for driver's ed. Well, I understand that argument, but I don't think it plays very well back home. And I don't think ultimately they're going to do anything radical with driver's ed. I don't know.
Got to talk about the Medicaid issue. Doug raised it a few minutes ago, and that is the Senate wants to take Medicaid out of the Department of Health and Human Services, create a new organization for it. It's going to eliminate the Certificate of Need. It's going to eliminate funding for CCNC, Community Care of North Carolina, eliminate a lot of personal services contracts, but it does throw doctors a little bit of a bone because it increases reimbursement for compensation, Medicaid reimbursement for doctors. Okay, this held up the budget negotiation last year. Are we going to see Medicaid reform this year? Is anything going to happen here, or are we just going to keep doing this dance?
I think there is a deal. I think there's a deal that's almost there. I think it is quite possible they will strike the deal. It will be somewhere between the two positions, the House position. Remember, both of them actually agree on some pretty basic things, like capitating Medicaid.
Yeah, right.
That's a pretty big change by itself. So either one of them does that. You're really debating, should the assignment of managed care networks be purely those led by health providers, or can you have commercial insurers? That's pretty much the main issue. I think ultimately they're going to bring the commercial insurers in at some point, even if they start with the...
All right, is that saying Certificate of Need is dead? Is that saying CCNC is dead, Chris?
Well, CCNC, it remains to be seen whether it's going to be part of this mix at all. The Senate obviously doesn't want it to be. Certificate of Need is another question. I think that's another place where we need to have separate legislation and have testimony and let the public and doctors participate in both chambers. I think it's ridiculous that that's in the budget, but I think the Senate leadership is going to insist on it.
So, Howard, can they shuttle that aside and say that's not going to be in this compromise plan and we'll deal with it later, or how are they going to do that?
I'm not sure how they'll do it, but certainly I think it's one of those that they just can't walk away from, and they're going to have to give it some serious consideration, and in the final analysis, I think it's got to be a part of it.
It's worth thinking that there are three things in the budget the hospitals don't like: getting rid of Certificate of Need, Medicaid reform, and ending their sales tax exemption for many of them. I think the Senate is basically saying, you get something here. Maybe we're not going to do all three to you, but which one do you hate the least?
Yeah. And I'm always uncomfortable when I disagree with John, but I don't think there's a deal very close at all. What I'm hearing is they're very far apart on
That's
this.
what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
And I'm hearing there's a lot of heat between the two houses as far as the approaches that they're going to make. After these messages, we're going to come back and talk about economic development and incentives and other budget differences.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
1 in 5 North Carolinians can't buy healthy foods in their communities, increasing their risk of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and some forms of cancer. It's time to invest in the Healthy Corner Store Initiative. Visit ncallianceforhealth.org to learn more.
Hi, I'm Linda Loveland. I want the best for my kids. Feeding them foods they like within my budget is a priority. But what do we really know about these foods? North Carolina farmers and food experts give you a website to find it all. FeedTheDialogueNC.com, a place where moms like you and me can learn more about the foods we eat and the farmers that feed us. Check it out. Add your input and help feed the dialogue. Let's talk food at FeedTheDialogueNC.com.
Every year, North Carolina patients undergo 635,000 same-day surgeries. 72% of these surgeries are performed in our highest-cost hospital facilities, adding as much as $2,000 to every procedure. The state's outdated Certificate of Need law prevents competition from lower-cost, higher-quality same-day surgery centers, inflating healthcare costs and limiting patient choice. Tell state lawmakers it's time to lower healthcare costs now. It's time to make a simple fix to an outdated law, increasing patient choice and lowering healthcare costs now. You can help. Visit reformconnow.com and tell lawmakers it's time for a simple fix to an outdated law. It's time to lower healthcare costs now.
All right. Going to go around the table here. Closing thoughts on the budget. What's going to happen, Chris?
Well, I'll quickly talk about the process. The General Assembly's taken the week after the 4th of July off for vacation. Many Republican legislators are going to the ALEC conference in San Diego the 3rd week of July. These are folks who came to Raleigh promising a quick, efficient, transparent government. They tried to be adjourned by July 4th. Now, July 4th used to be the goal to leave. Now it's a vacation time. We're looking at August or Labor Day for folks who thought they were going to run government more efficiently.
Interesting. Doug, final thoughts on the budget?
I'll get on my yearly soapbox that's something that seems so common sense and can never get done. Right now, counties are having to vote on budgets when they're hitting a moving number from the state budget. The state rarely makes the goal. We either need to give the counties a longer time or require something, but the money that is wasted on rough estimates on county budgets is just staggering, and the fact the state never meets the deadline, something needs to be done about that.
And schools are getting ready to take in again in August, and they don't know what they're going to have to spend, do they, Howard? Tell us your final thoughts on the budget.
They really don't, and that's one of the great complaints I continuously get as I move around and meet with school leaders.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on the budget compromise?
None more than the fact that I have never seen a budget document this thick. 508
pages. Reading like War and Peace.
Tom, there is a provision that's gotten some attention that would do away with state employee and teacher retiree health benefits. Right. It's getting a lot of controversy, but actually that benefit is unaffordable. They have promised this for decades. They have saved no money for it. We are tens of billions of dollars into an unfunded liability. This is not really a policy change. This is just a nod to reality. Those benefits cannot be paid in the future. It's just not going to happen.
So it's not
they'd have to
retroactively. It's prospectively.
No, it's prospective. It's talking about the future for new hires.
Yes.
And the point is, if we were going to actually satisfy that benefit, we'd have to put $1 billion a year away. No one is going to do that.
All right. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, and read our weekly column, be sure to visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And we hope you'll join us next week for our red, white, and blue edition of NC Spin, when we'll have more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.